I want to go back to the energy and climate issue now and talk about where the government is going with this issue. During the campaign, I spoke a couple of times to the Queensland backbencher Keith Pitt. He joined me again on the issue just a few minutes ago. Keith Pitt, thanks for joining us and congratulations on holding your seat.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be with you and great to be with your viewers, Chris.
We talked a lot before the election about the energy and climate issues. These were central in the campaign. You were one of those people who really thought it was an argument that favoured the coalition, that Labor's plans were too much of a risk. You were pro-Adani, pro-affordable, reliable energy. I suppose you feel very vindicated on those arguments?
Oh, I'm pro-common sense, Chris, and I think this election's been a victory for common sense overall. We put forward a balanced proposition that's been accepted by the Australian people, and in my view we have a mandate now to implement those policies.
There's a lot of focus on Queensland. Obviously you've got a Queensland seat where some of the jobs and some of the investment from the Adani coal mine and others will play a big role, and debate about it has played a big role. But how much do you see these issues as playing out across the country in suburban and regional electorates around the country, where people are obviously concerned about economic development but also the power prices they face?
Well, whilst we talk about Adani, I mean, it's only one part of the Galilee Basin and proposed Carmichael mine, but it's actually about jobs. And I think what really got up people's noses was the Bob Brown convoy. You know, to have these wealthy idealists drive their way in their gas-guzzling cars into central Queensland and tell our people that they can't have a job because their ideals said so, I think that really upset them. I think the risk with Bill Shorten, particularly around the 50% renewable energy target, I mean, everybody knows that their power prices have continued to go up, in Queensland in particular, where it's entirely owned by the state Labor government. They've only got to look back a few years, and you know, most of them, they can all remember how long ago it was that power prices were very affordable and certainly wasn't the top 2 or 3 costs in business. And they know what's driven it. So they didn't want to risk it with Bill Shorten and his crazy left-wing ideals. They've accepted our balanced approach, and look, I think that's good news for the country, and we just need to get on with it.
Well, speaking of getting on with it, the challenge now is to do something, is to implement changes that put further downward pressure on prices and improve the reliability and affordability of energy more widely. Talk of the big stick legislation that the government couldn't get through before the election. Angus Taylor now saying that's going to be a high priority. Critics saying, of course, this is going to be the government intervening, meddling in a market.
Well, look, the electricity market is not a true market. It's subsidised in all sorts of directions. It is not a truly competitive market. If that was the case, well, electricity would be much more affordable. The reality is there is interventions right across all of the different states. I mean, you only have to look at South Australia and Victoria, where they closed perfectly good coal-fired power stations to replace them with unreliable renewable sources. And then in South Australia, that became the highest-priced electricity in the world. Now, it's a pretty clear comparison. So the big stick legislation, including the divestiture powers, which is what most people are hung up on, is important. It's the government's policy. It is, of course, an action of last resort. But if they don't want to play ball, then we will force them to it, Chris.
And well, this will force them to sell assets if they're not actually, as you say, playing ball, doing enough to keep prices down, doing enough to keep power supplies reliable. Will you see a situation where the government would actually take ownership of these assets or force them to sell to other private operators?
Well, the divestiture requirements would be that you would break energy companies up. Now, in government-owned corporations, such as in Queensland, that would be into other government-owned corporations. And to be brutally frank, that's what used to exist before. The Labor state government actually amalgamated the generators into 2 businesses. It used to be 3. And certainly in terms of the regional distribution, it used to be any number throughout Queensland. That has reduced competition. The price has gone up with it. And the Queensland Labor government has used that opportunity to place more taxes on the people of Queensland and businesses of Queensland through electricity costs. They're now raking $1.5 billion a year out of that industry. That hurts everybody, and certainly businesses are really doing it tough.
This is a sector, though, where, of course, different arms of government policy are pushing in different directions. You mentioned those coal-fired power stations closed in South Australia and Victoria. They're closed largely because of the government intervention of the renewable energy target, forcing more renewables into the market, meaning that coal-fired power at times is undercut by energy that's essentially free, and then at other times it can't fire up. And those policies are designed to drive coal-fired power out of the market, and yet now you're looking at a situation where another coal-fired power station like Liddell, slotted to close in 2022, you might have this big stick legislation effectively trying to get the company, get AGL to keep it open, to keep it operating.
All those things are true. I spoke against the renewable energy target when it was put forward because, in my view, it would increase the price of power, it would make the system less reliable, it would be paid for by the poorest people in this country. Now, unfortunately, all of those things have come to pass. And, you know, it's always tough to speak against your own government's policy, but at the time I thought I was right. That's history now. We need to get on with the processes that we have. In my view, the real danger now is in New South Wales and Victoria in particular. If they continue to lose reliable generating capacity, there will be real problems in summer this year. Certainly we saw some challenges in the previous Christmas period. But we've got to ensure that people maintain the existing network. We don't allow any more to close without replacement. But you're right. I mean, this rush to solar in particular has meant that baseload stations like coal have been displaced. The way their fuel model works, they have to run all of the time, regardless of whether they have large amounts of generation or not. And if you really want to talk about emissions, Chris, the best thing you can do for a coal-fired power station is have it run at 100% load. It is far more efficient, 100% loaded, than it is otherwise, and their emissions are much lower per megawatt hour. But, you know, that's just a practical common sense view.
I agree with your earlier point about the electricity market, which is why I find it laughable that so many sort of leftist commentators are saying what's happening here, a coalition government is interfering in an anti-market way. It is such a distorted market. There are so many government interventions in it, so if you need this heavy hand of government to try and force more competition and accountability, then it can be easily justified. The big question, of course, is whether you can get it through the Senate.
Well, look, I'm sure those negotiations will continue. We'll treat senators with respect, as we always do. They all get a vote. But I think they see the sense here. People are really struggling with cost of living. It was one of the biggest issues during the campaign. It's another reason why they didn't trust Bill Shorten and what Labor was proposing, because of what it would do to their pockets. So whether they were a retiree, whether they were trying to pay their power bills, or they just wanted to have a job. It's one of the reasons that working people in particular voted for the coalition for the very first time. Now, our job over the term is to deliver our policies that we put forward, but it's also to ensure that we continue to hold the trust of those individuals. The Labor Party does not represent working people anymore. They represent, left-wing idealists from the inner city. And I think everyone that's out there, whether they're on the tools or wearing their steel-cap boots or putting their helmet on, knows that that's the case.
Keith Pitt, two other things quickly before I let you go. Firstly, your electorate of Hinkler fronts onto the Great Barrier Reef. There'd be a lot of tourism workers, a lot of tourism industry associated with the Great Barrier Reef in your electorate. What do you see as the main threat to the viability, the future of the Great Barrier Reef?
We're known as the gateway for the southern end of the reef. It sits slightly to the north of Bundaberg Port. And I've said this before, Chris, the southern part of the reef is actually in the best condition it's been in for a long time. Mate, I've got to tell you, I got absolutely slammed on Twitter and Facebook and emails and everything else. But that's what all the reports say, and certainly the anecdotal evidence from the people that I talk to who are out there every day is that it's actually in really, really good condition. So we need to stop talking the reef down. It is an important tourism asset. There are parts of the reef which are in incredibly good condition. We need to look after it. And I'm really pleased that Warren Entsch has got a gig as the Great Barrier Reef envoy. Entsch is very passionate about it, particularly up in the north, and I think he'll do a wonderful job.
All right, and secondly, with the ministry sworn in today, did the Nats get screwed over in the allocation of portfolios?
Well, those debates are had between the two leaders. I mean, as an individual, Chris, I'm disappointed, but what do you say, mate? Life's full of disappointments. So we just get on with it.
So you reckon the Nats...
I'm sure they'll do a good job.
So the Nats were screwed over?
Well, look, that's not what I'm saying at all. Those negotiations take place between the two leaders. As a humble backbencher, mate, it's not up to me to determine what those allocations are, but our job is to represent regional people to the best of our ability. That's what I'll continue to do. That's what I've done for the last 2 terms. It's a pretty tough circumstances at times, I've got to say, when you stand up against your own government's policy. But I've got to say, we were proven right. Working people in particular, they want to ensure they keep their jobs. It's the reason we stood up for coal-fired power stations and a common sense approach on energy, and particularly for the resources sector, which drives over $200 billion of the Australian economy. You can't just go to these people and say that, well, we're going to get rid of your industry because we just don't like it. Those people who live at Potts Point have decided that you can't have a job. Well, the rest of us think that's unacceptable, and they've spoken very, very clearly.